Ulaminaka, and welcome to For the Record. Over the last few weeks, we have consistently brought you coverage of Tropical Cyclone Winston, its aftermath, its recovery, and we've spoken to some of the people who've been on the ground helping families who've been affected by the devastation. One of the biggest responses we've seen has been from the international community, a lot of goodwill pouring in and a lot of aid. And now, as far as the coordination of this international aid is concerned, we have with us in studio the humanitarian coordinator for these international organizations, who is Ms. Osnat Lubrani, who is also the resident coordinator for the United Nations in Fiji and the Pacific. Ms. Lubrani, thank you very much for being on the show. Over the last few weeks, there have been tons and tons of aid that has been coming into Fiji, food, shelter, what have you, building materials, all sorts of medical supplies as well. How does the role of the humanitarian coordinator fit into all of this? Is it that all these international partners of Fiji are going through your office, or is it more of sort of collaborating with each other?
Well, since tropical cyclone hit devastated Fiji, what has been triggered is a UN coordinated response, which I am responsible for. And what that means is that you have personnel, expertise, experience, resources being deployed in an organized, coordinated way to support the government of Fiji in bringing relief quickly, efficiently, effectively to those who have been affected by the disaster. So that also, again, led by the government through cluster systems that focus on the areas that you had just mentioned, food security, water, sanitation, health, shelter and social protection, logistics, working together in a coordinated way to really make sure that there's no duplication of efforts, that there is accountability, and that the government is really supported to really save lives and help the people.
We've spoken generally about some of the areas that the international community is helping in. Let's break it down. When we talk about sanitation, social security, medicine, what have you, what sort of shipments are we seeing coming in? Are we talking about a few tons? Are we talking about months and months of supply? And what specifically?
The immediate humanitarian needs are going to sort of last up to, I would say, several months after the cyclone, and this is where we're really working to replace supplies that have been, for example, health supplies that have been destroyed. If it's in schools, repairing the schools, bringing in sanitation basic sanitation needs. So I think what is important to explain is that a lot has already arrived. So, for example, you have over 100,000 people that have received safe drinking water, but there are still many more left. I believe up to 100,000 that still don't have access to water. We are now entering this stage of the humanitarian assistance where, in the words of the Prime Minister at the launch of our flash appeal, where we have been asking for financial support for this relief, he said we need to make sure that no one is left behind. And that is where I also wanted to point out that the way the system works is that we really need to have the right data so that we really know who has received aid and where have we missed someone who is really in need of support. And it's not always easy because people move around, the needs change, and it's to really access those who are the most vulnerable and the most in need, you need to be very proactive.
And how does this work with what the government's national emergency response is doing? Are you sort of working in collaboration? Does the government tell you, tell the donor organizations what the needs are, or is it sort of working separately but simultaneously?
Certainly, in each of the sectors, it is led by the government ministry. Of course, it's all coordinated very closely through the National Disaster Management Office under the leadership of Minister responsible for disasters, Minister Sri Ratu, and that coordination that the government has, that's what we sort of plug into. But again, what I want to say is that the UN response and the support that we give has been, I believe, very much appreciated and supportive of the government efforts, because it is a very devastating disaster that I don't think Fiji has ever experienced before. So in terms of how to coordinate, how to get the systems in place, that's where we bring in certain expertise that can be useful. So if I can provide another example, of course, bilateral donors such as Australia and New Zealand have come in with enormously useful support, including the military assets that have really been so instrumental to getting supplies delivered. But the UN coordination team that was deployed has been very helpful in ensuring that civil-military cooperation, so that when the ships go out, that when the helicopters go out, there is a coordinated way so that they're used to the maximum to really bring the relief supplies. And that's quite a complex system, but that's where we have that experience, having worked in so many places where such disasters have taken place, from the Philippines to Nepal to different areas.
Okay, and with that, Ms. Lubrani, we'll take a break. Stay with us. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to the show. We are speaking with Ms. Osnat Lubrani, the Humanitarian Coordinator for International Partners of Fiji post-Tropical Cyclone Winston. Ms. Lubrani, when we say Humanitarian Coordinator for International Partners, how many organizations do you have who are working with the UN and through the UN, or through your humanitarian coordinators ambit?
I would hesitate to give a specific number, but there are, I would imagine, around 12 UN or so United Nations agencies. There are also international NGOs that are involved, and also I want to acknowledge national NGOs. You know, you have the EFCOS, which is coordinating that, and we try to also coordinate with them. What is very important for the government is that all support that is delivered is somehow registered, so that we know who received and who didn't receive. And sometimes it's easy to reach those who are easier to reach. People want to provide support, but what we experienced in the beginning was that people who were more in the interland were not receiving. So, you know, how to balance that out and how to coordinate that is something that we try to do with all of the partners. So there are very many of them, some of them national and others foreign, that have come in to support, bringing in comparative advantage and expertise in specific areas.
What would you need as humanitarian coordinator from these partners in order to assist the government and the people who have been affected, as we discussed tonight?
Well, I think what is, you know, we speak a lot about anyone that is involved in this UN system, and that goes for governments as well as non-governmental actors, has to abide by humanitarian principles. And that is really ensuring impartiality, ensuring a human rights-based approach, ensuring ownership by the communities, so you really listen to the priorities of the people, and certainly also, of course, supporting the national authorities in a coordinated way.
The UN has also supplied shelter tents to families, and shelter for schools as well, a few thousand tents to my understanding. How many do you hope to be able to supply? Because shelter, of course, is a basic need.
Shelter is still indeed a very important need. There have been thousands of tents and tarpaulins that have been already provided. So some of the needs are met, but a lot of people still don't have the kind of safe shelter that is needed. This is where, on the one hand, more efforts are now being done to provide people with tools so that they can build, on the one hand. A lot of efforts are also being invested in helping to clear debris in a safe way, I want to say, and this is where some of the initiatives of the agencies are very important, to clearing that debris in a proper way, so that people are protected, and also to clear the land so that food can be replanted. So all of these efforts are happening, but I also want to introduce here an element that I think is on all of our minds, and that is, how can we ensure that in rebuilding we also build back better? And I know that for the government of Fiji this is also a priority. So we need to balance the need between having to really look at ensuring that people can restore their daily lives and have shelter in the immediate term, but also planning better and ensuring that you build back better and safer for the future.
Well, the government has indicated that in its plan to build back better, they will recommend to communities and villages to maybe move if they are living in a vulnerable area, and to build houses that are more resilient to natural disasters. That's the government's plan. What would the United Nations or what would the humanitarian coordinator bring to the table in these discussions, and as the country leans more towards, as we said, building back better?
Well, you know, perhaps this is an opportunity for me to talk a little bit about a meeting that is happening next month, which is the World Humanitarian Summit, and that the UN Secretary General has called for. And one of the questions that I think is very timely to be asking now is, how do you link the humanitarian response in a better way to development and to climate change? And those precise topics are going to be discussed by leaders there. So the part that I am currently focused on is really on that immediate life-saving needs of people. But already there has been a process that has started now just this week in Fiji, and to look more at the medium-term needs for recovery, and that is an analysis that is being supported by the UN, the World Bank, and the European Union and other partners. That will be coming within the next month, and then we will know what the actual loss is and what is actually needed. And here I want to express the hope that the international community will be generous in supporting Fiji to do what I think Fijians want, which is to invest in building back better. It's sometimes more expensive, it's more complicated, but in the end it makes economic sense as well, not just humanitarian sense. It makes economic sense, because if you invest now, then you will not have the same impact as before. And another area that I do also want to talk about is the need for preparedness to build resilience.
Of course, we'll pick on that shortly. But while we're still talking about communities building back better, a lot of these homes, as we've been talking about previously with other guests, and has been covered by a lot of government representatives, a lot of these homes weren't built up to scratch, up to normal building codes, and that caused a lot of homes to be destroyed, and in some cases caused lives to be lost. But as we talk tonight, these very families, some of them still don't have shelter, and some have tents, others makeshift homes. For them, the priority would be having a house, having a roof over their heads as quickly as possible, maybe not built to the expectations that we would ask of them for their future needs. I mean, how do we go around that? Because let's face it, thousands of people right now, they need a home. They don't care if it's resilient. Maybe they can look to that in the future, maybe later, but right now they just need a house.
That's true, and I think that you're presenting something that is a very realistic picture. I think it's going to take time for Fiji to fully recover from the impact of this disaster, and some of the measures have to be taken in the medium to the longer term. So I don't think that one sort of cancels the other. Particularly when you're looking at public infrastructure, at rebuilding the schools, at rebuilding community halls, there are a lot of lessons to be learned on how to build it back better. With the private homes, of course, it's also a challenge. But I think you mentioned the issue of enforcement of laws. Those are things that slowly will have to be looked at as we move forward.
All right, and with that, we've come to the end of another segment. We'll be back shortly. Good evening and welcome back to For the Record. Our guest tonight is the humanitarian coordinator for the recovery period after Tropical Cyclone Winston, Ms. Osnat Lubrani. Ms. Lubrani, you mentioned the need for preparedness. That's been one of the keywords that has been going around, especially after seeing the number of people who lost their lives and the extent of damage. Of course, this particular disaster could not it's one of the worst we've seen. So the question that people are asking is, could we really have been prepared for something this severe, bearing in mind that it's caused by climate change?
There's always more we can do to be better prepared. And I think that is where we have to fully draw the lessons learned from this very difficult experience to ensure that we learn and can prepare. So let me share with you, for example, one of the things that I think that is very, very important. This I also witnessed in TC Pam, Tropical Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, and again when I visited Koro, when people did receive warnings, there were warnings, and the system sort of worked. But when I spoke to the people, they said we didn't understand what is a category 5. So you tell people category 5, it wasn't spelled out that this is, you have to take your kids and just run, and it's very, very dangerous. They didn't understand about storm surge, that it could be so devastating. In the case of Koro, there were 3 of these waves, and the scale of the disaster that is caused wasn't really explained to people. So there is an element of ensuring that every man, woman, and child, everyone in the community really understands what it means, and when the government sort of comes up with these announcements, that these are done in a way that everyone is clear on what this means and what they need, and know what they need to do. So continuously improving the early warning systems is very important. This is something that the UN Office for Humanitarian Coordination that I'm now working with closely also does a lot of training together with other partners, in regional partners and other partners supporting the government. So we are drawing these lessons, and that's something that we will look to follow up on.
So this sort of preparedness comes into effect as and whenever there is a natural disaster or something that's headed our way. What about long-term preparedness?
Well, that again is where I think it's important to when, for example, if you look at Fiji, Fiji is now, before the cyclone arrived, there was work ongoing on a development plan. So I think what this experience tells us, and this was something that was highlighted in one of the conferences that took place last year in Sendai in Japan, on building that resilience and disaster proofing development. So that needs to be sort of looked at in every stage in order to really be prepared and to reduce the risks. There's also a lot of work that can be done, and again, that's where I think that linking the humanitarian to recovery, to development, also to climate change is very important. We've heard a lot of talk about the climate change agreement that was signed. Fiji has just ratified it. I know the Prime Minister will be in New York for that ceremony for ratification. So there's a lot of effort on that. But what does that mean, climate change? Where does that money, financing to adapt and to mitigate climate change go? So all of that needs to somehow be interlinked. And that's what needs to happen for better preparedness and for really building resilience.
Well, I mean, I would really like to talk more about climate change and TC Winston sort of joined together. But let's go back to TC Winston for a bit. The point being that you've been out, you've seen most of the communities as we move away from TC Winston slowly. But what do you see as the long-term needs, not just at family and community level, but for Fiji on a humanitarian scale?
Well, I think I do want to commend the government. I think there's been a lot of very good cooperation and a lot of very speedy effort. I think there will be a room to sort of review the systems that are in place, how we can, make assessments in a more sort of efficient way. So there are different areas that are needed. One area that I didn't touch on, and I do feel very important to raise, is all of the protection and psychosocial needs that have arisen. A disaster like this takes people into a state of shock, and that has affected children, it has affected families, it has sometimes raised tension in communities, and all of those things require also special attention and support. People living in evacuation centers, very crowded. So those I think issues are extremely important to deal with. And when we talk about, I've mentioned a little bit the health concerns on the hygiene, on communicable diseases that and waterborne diseases and so on and so forth. But also the social and mental well-being of people is also something very important. Phenomena such as instances of violence against women are also things that can sometimes be seen on the rise. So that's where we again need to have those referral systems in place. And I know a lot of good work has been done. Those are things that are also very important to pay attention.
And would these international partners be assisting in this psychosocial sort of aspect of TC Winston in the long term? How far ahead have you planned?
I think there is a lot of, the sort of the positive side of a crisis like this is that partnerships that have existed before become even tighter. So I can certainly say that some of the UN agencies and are working very closely with Ministry of Health, with Ministry of Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation, and putting those systems as we respond to the disaster, putting in new systems and new procedures that are very much needed. So I do think that cooperation is going to continue also into the medium and long term.
Okay, and with that, we've come to the end of another segment. We'll take a break now. When we come back, we'll talk more about climate change. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight as we speak with Ms. Osnat Lubrani, the Humanitarian Coordinator for International Partners post-Tropical Cyclone Winston. Ms. Lubrani, climate change has come up once or twice during our discussions tonight, and one of the comments you hear is that the severity of Tropical Cyclone Winston is an example of how climate change is affecting our part of the world, if not the entire world. And so it would lead to the train of thought that it doesn't matter what we do, the cyclones, these storms are going to get stronger and stronger, and will continue to keep building and rebuilding and rebuilding.
I have to say that since I first came to this region, unfortunately the new normal in the Pacific is that every year, come the cyclone season, we are bound to see a very extreme natural disaster take place. Certainly my experience when I first arrived, the first one was the floods disaster in the Solomon Islands, followed by Tropical Cyclone Pam last year in Vanuatu, and this year Tropical Cyclone Winston in Fiji. There is a lot of people of the Pacific and certainly people of Fiji have experienced cyclones before. Here it was Cyclone Evans in 2012. And there is a lot of resilience, there is a lot of knowledge, but we do need to do more because of the impacts of climate change. Certainly, even before the cyclone came, together with my partners in the UN system, focusing on humanitarian preparedness and response, we spoke a lot about the El Niño phenomenon, which is still, by the way, upon us. And according to the weather predictions, it's still going to continue into June or even July. And what that means is that we have extreme weather conditions that can produce these cyclones, but also, I have to say, drought conditions that can again result in humanitarian problems. In the North Pacific right now, there's a state of emergency declared in Palau and in the Marshall Islands because of severe water shortages. And in relation to Tropical Cyclone Winston, I want to say that while there has been a lot of work, ongoing work to distribute seeds and seedlings and to do replanting, but we are worried that if there is going to be shortage of rain, that may also impact food security. So all of that means that we do need to take more actions to do even better on preparing. And it's not that there isn't more that we could do. And I can say in terms of choosing which crops to plant, there is a lot that we can do, as I mentioned before, in terms of looking at building codes, how you plan cities and how you plan urban centers, the preparedness that I mentioned, adaptation measures that are done through a lot of very good climate change projects that are being supported now by the Green Climate Fund, by the Global Environment Fund. There are a lot of opportunities for us to really build that resilience even more and also develop new knowledge and innovation. We need that as well.
You brought up the point of the UN meeting later on this month, where Fiji's Prime Minister will be handing over the ratification documents to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is fundamentally, as people say, our last best hope for ensuring that climate change is controlled, that carbon emissions are controlled. But also, once it's signed and the agreement is adopted, a lot of funds become available for countries like Fiji. Would you say that once these do come in, the areas that you spoke about, building codes, crop management, the money could be poured into these sectors, or do you think, now, because we need a lot of money to rebuild, some of the money should be diverted to TC Winston recovery if it comes in time?
Well, I think there is a lot of ways to orient funds and develop and design interventions that really support what we've learned that is needed as a result of this cyclone. So that's something certainly to be looked at. I can tell you that I also besides being humanitarian coordinator, manage UNDP, and what we've done is we look through all of our programs, and I know a lot of other UN agencies have done the same, looked at their ongoing development programs, and very much with support of our donors, reoriented that to the humanitarian and to the recovery phase. So I think part of that can be built into new programs, and again, as I mentioned, we'll need to rethink and really do development in a different way, where we look at what the risks are and how can we do development in a risk-proof way. And certainly now another important landmark agreement was the signing of the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the thing about those 17 goals is that you can't do just one without looking at all of the others, and many of them are really focused on climate change, on natural resource management, urbanization, all of these things interlinked together.
Well, it's an interesting point you make about everything being interlinked, urbanization and development and whatnot, because in Fiji and maybe even in the Pacific, that link does not exist as yet. People in the grassroots realize that climate change for them is a very high risk issue. They are losing their land, their homes, whereas people in the urban settings, I can give you an example of, say, Suva. People may talk about climate change. They might say, oh, climate change is a big worry, but they don't physically see it in their backyard. So that link doesn't really exist at the moment. Is that an accurate observation?
I do think that you point to something that I think is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. I think it's a very ambitious agenda. It clearly spells what the priorities are that we need to be working on. But in order to achieve it, we need to maybe rethink the how. And the how means that there needs to be more inclusivity, there needs to be more dialogue between, you said, people on the ground, government ministries, other actors with expertise, whether it's academia, non-governmental organizations are doing fantastic work in Fiji and in every country. And the private sector as well has a very important role to play. So ensuring that is forging those partnerships with accountability to delivering, so that we don't just pass a law or develop a strategy, but that we are all accountable to showing results. Did it actually deliver? Do we need to change it? Is it working or is it not working? And that's where I think every ministry, every organization, every sector in society has to come on board.
Okay, with that, we take another break, Ms. Lubrani. Stay with us. When we come back, we'll wrap up for the evening. Good evening and welcome back. We will continue discussions with Ms. Lubrani, the Humanitarian Coordinator for International Partners post-Tropical Cyclone Winston. Ms. Lubrani, let's sort of go back towards Tropical Cyclone Winston for the time being, not just climate change wise, but in response to natural disasters such as TC Winston. How would international donors be able to help in resilience measures, not just in the immediate humanitarian needs that Fiji has?
Well, I had mentioned that there is an exercise that is ongoing to really begin looking at the actual loss for the economy and the costs of the recovery, and certainly some of the multilateral partners are eager to see the figures that emerge from that. And again, I want to express my hope that the international community will be generous in helping that recovery process to proceed quickly, so that Fiji can sort of recover fully from this event. I also do want to mention, however, that Fiji, for the United Nations, Fiji is a place, is a hub for all of our regional activities. There is a lot to be learned that Fiji can share with other Pacific countries, that we need to capture that as well. This is something that we will also look to support Fiji to do. It's important for us to know what we can learn from this. But certainly I know that the government and just going out there and talking to people in the West, in the maritime region, in Vanuatu, there is a lot of hope. I went to Vanuatu and the school was still damaged, but kids were going to class, the teachers were teaching. So there is that push to get things back to normal on the one hand, but at the same time we do need that support from the international community, from donors for the medium and longer term.
So last question for this evening. All said and done, if you look back, what would you like to have seen that these international partners have been able to contribute?
I think there is a lot that has been contributed, as I said, through the systems and expertise and funding that has been deployed through the flash appeal. I do want to say, though, that the flash appeal that we have launched, which was for just over 38 million, was only a third funded. There are still needs there. So I would hope that donors will still sort of continue to look at those needs right now, which are still very, very important, and I want to flag that. And perhaps we need also to make all partners aware of what are the benefits of going through this system. But overall, I think very good cooperation with the national partners, and I think a lot has been achieved, a lot learned. But for now, for the next month or two, we still need to focus on those and ensure that no one's left behind.
Ms. Lubrani, thank you very much for being on the show tonight, and best of luck to you in all the work that you're doing, helping the people and the government of Fiji post-Tropical Cyclone Winston.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Naka. That was our show for this evening. Remember, if you have any comments or questions, you can email us for the record at fbc.com.fj. That's it from me for tonight. But up next is the My Say segment with Jyoti Pratibha. I will see you next Sunday. Good evening.